University. All right. I'll put his University of Pennsylvania full bio here in the chat in just a second. But I'll give a bit of an overview. We're going to have a presentation from Professor Richter, followed by discussant questions for the presentation from Matteo Agustino and Dalian Doncor, who are here with us. And then from there, we will move into larger questions from the group here with us. So we'll try to do those through the chat if you have questions. It looks like it's not such a big group, so we could potentially just ask people to ask their questions directly. That's more personable. But does that sound right, Professor Richter? Would you like to take it away and lead us to the polder?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm already in the polder. Let me see if I can share the screen, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Let me...
Oh, yeah, you have to enable that.
No, I think Hilda's the host. Hilda, is it ready for that? Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let's see. All righty. Okay. You all should be able to see that. Good. Yeah, I had to give this a title, so there you go. It's called Between Need, which stands for the Northern European Enclosure Dam, and the German border, the big decision that lies ahead for the Netherlands. And let me, oops, what's going on here? I'm unable to advance. Oh, I see. I got to advance over there. All right. That's good. So let me explain why I am where I am, what I'm doing. So I'm currently in a little village called Haastrecht, which is near Gouda. So I'm deep in the polder. I'm probably about 4 meters below sea level here. And I'm here with 6 undergraduate students from the University of Pennsylvania who are poltergeist artists. We've worked with more than 6, but these are currently the poltergeist artists. Poltergeist is a series of animated videos that we have been making about cultural aspects, about climate adaptation in the Netherlands. And this is the first time that we've taken artists with us. And I'm using we there because my co-director, Joshua Mosley, who's a professor of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania, is with me as well. And we thought it was really important for the students to come along because the Dutch landscape is a really, really difficult landscape to understand. It takes some time to get used to it. Most of it, of course, is artificial. It's been created, and it's been created over a long time. And it takes a while before you get a sense of how it fits together. And in addition, depth matters so much. And in two-dimensional photographs or drawings or a video that you see, you cannot get a sense of height and depth. So it was really important to us, we thought, to bring them here. So this is an experiment. They're in their 4th week. We're working on 2 videos right now. One is on subsidence and the other one is on dredging. Here we are actually talking to someone from Boskalis and from Rijkswaterstaat. Boskalis is one of the 2 really big Dutch dredging firms, and we're on the island of Texel. All right, so I'm not going to talk too much more about that. You'll get some sense of poltergeist, but that's not my focus today. I want to instead talk with you about how the Dutch are responding to the uncertainty that comes with climate change, and particularly the role that Antarctica is playing already and is certainly going to play in the future. This is an image you're looking at here that was produced by Deltaris, which is the premier water and soil institute, research institute in the Netherlands. And on the right, you see a representation of the Netherlands with a storm surge barrier in the front, the famous Maasland storm surge barrier. Out of the picture is the Eastern Scheldt storm surge barrier. Up in the right middle, you see, it looks very small there, but that's the IJsselmeer, so the IJssel Lake, and the Afsluitdijk, the dam that closed off that interior sea from the North Sea. And so on. So you get a sense, there are the dunes, you get a sense of that being the Netherlands. But I think what's really, really interesting is that Antarctica is in the picture, right? Antarctica is at a great distance from the Netherlands, but it was important for Deltares to place Antarctica this close to the coast of the Netherlands because that's how impactful that will be on this water protection system, this water defense system that is in place in the Netherlands. Just a quick reminder, 26% of the Netherlands is below sea level, and a further something like 34% is liable to river flooding and other forms of flooding, making a good 60% of the Netherlands vulnerable. All right, let's see what we got. All right, let's talk about this uncertainty. What I encounter in the Netherlands a good bit, and I'm sure that this is not exclusive to the Netherlands, is something that I call sea level rise optimism. The sense that it's not going to be that bad. Hopefully it won't be, but I don't think it is good for planners to be sea level rise optimists at this stage. I have a quote here from my new colleague. He's been with us for, I guess he's entering his second year at the University of Pennsylvania, Mike Mann. He here is referring to uncertainty around the West Antarctic ice sheet and the Greenland ice sheet, and even a bit of the East Antarctic ice sheet as well. That accounts for some 10 meters of sea level rise that we could commit to in the very near future, in the absence of concerted climate action. So the concern is that what's going on in Antarctica, the news that we get from Antarctica based on the science that is being, sort of desperately conducted to try to understand the mechanisms that are at work there. That news is unsettling, unnerving, and it's new territory. We have no idea how this works, how quickly it could work, and just to lay back and say, it's going to take centuries and centuries, nothing to be really worried about, doesn't seem the appropriate posture. All right, so what are the Dutch doing? One of the reasons I'm here, and one of the reasons I'm so intensely interested in what's going on in the Netherlands, is that around 2017 or so, I got wind of the fact that the Dutch were really intensely looking into how they would respond to accelerated sea level rise. And you see here the 4 adaptation paths that they have identified. They are 2 on the top are protection scenarios. So one is protect closed, which looks a lot like a fortress and involves pumping out the Rhine and the Meuse. The second is protect open, in which case the rivers remain open for trade, for all of the transport that is conducted on those riverways or waterways. But as you can see, that means that the land around the rivers is well below the rivers. And that also creates an unusual and difficult or complicated situation. A third option is called save arts or advance. And unfortunately, that's not very clear. But at any rate, what that entails is moving out from the coast and creating a protective barrier of a kind. And that's one that often appeals sort of to the Dutch imaginary, that sort of bustling, frenetic activity, and also, prosecuting the war against water, as they call it, at a very advanced level. And the really surprising one to me was meebewegen, which is the word that they use for accommodate and retreat as well. It means sort of moving with the flow or living with water. And as you can see there, that represents an inundation of the low-lying parts of the Netherlands, so the western part of the Netherlands. And I thought, my goodness, a country that actually contemplates inundation of its territory, that has got to be very interesting. So I wanted to know a lot more about that. Okay, so today we're going to talk about these two extremes. I understand them as being opposites. The one is Zeevaart, so advancing towards the sea, taking the fight to the water. And the other one, in English, we would use the word retreat, right? So advanced retreat, it's opposite, apparently. Which means pulling back to some extent, or finding some way to accommodate water, to make peace with water, and adapt in that way. So we're going to look at those two. Now, here you see a thumbnail of one of the videos that we made. This one is called, "Is the Netherlands Too Deep to Fail?" It concerned, for the most part, the decision on the part of the Dutch to build 1 million new homes in 10 years. And when a study was done, it turned out that 82% of those homes were planned for low-lying and vulnerable areas. And in the two instances that you see there, the Zuidplaspolder, which is at around close to 7 meters below sea level already, and Arnhem, where the development is occurring outside of the dikes that protect the city from the river, the Nether Rhine. In those two in those two instances, it's sort of very flagrant, this kind of defiance with regard to the circumstances. And we wondered, what's going on here? Is there this unspoken belief, perhaps, that the government will intervene, almost in the way that during the 2008 financial crisis, the government intervened because those banks were too big to fail? Is the Netherlands too deep to fail? And we wondered, if that's the case, what are people kind of imagining? What sort of intervention are they imagining will be let's say, big enough to protect the Netherlands if sea level rise accelerates, to 2 meters or 3 meters, even to 5 meters? How could the Netherlands be protected? And you may have heard about this. This was quite a splash a couple of years ago. An oceanographer, a Dutch oceanographer, came up with a plan that he called the Northern European Enclosure Dam. It's an extreme form of advance. It envisions a dam that would run from the tip of France to the tip of England, and then from Scotland by way of the Orkneys to Norway. A very, very bold intervention that would convert the North Sea and the Baltic Sea eventually into fresh bodies of fresh water, which would maintain current sea level in those two bodies of water, and allow the oceans to rise as they pleased, or as they must, because of the carbon we put into the atmosphere. When he proposed this, he published this in a scientific journal that was peer-reviewed, which quite remarkable. And it was very clear from the beginning that this intervention was meant to be a provocation. People should read this and say, that is utterly crazy. It would be nuts to do this. And therefore, it is all the more important that we mitigate. Unfortunately, it turned out that a number of folks at the Technical University in Delft actually think this is a charming idea, and are currently investigating, just exactly how feasible this is. All right, so that to me represents the extreme of advance. I don't think I have to say too much more about that. I'm sure you're convinced that it's hard to imagine anything more extreme than that when you consider all of the environmental consequences, how very difficult or complicated it would be to get a bunch of European nations who seem to have a great deal of difficulty deciding on other things related to climate, not to mention other things besides climate, a UK that has pulled out of the EU, all of those complications. You would have to get them all lined up, to execute this plan. Now I want to talk about meebewegen with you. because this plan is also out there. The strategy is also out there. Yesterday, in fact, I participated in a session that was organized by Rijkswaterstaat, that's the body entrusted with water security in the Netherlands, who looks after roads and waterways and the whole water defense system and so on. And this was part of a project that is called the Knowledge Program for Sea Level Rise. So this is the official program that is investigating these 4 adaptation strategies or pathways to see, you know, what do we know? What do we still need to know? What would it entail to do this or to do that? And so I'm very, very pleased to say that they are seriously looking into, let's say, we could call it the imaginary logistics of retreat and accommodate. Yesterday at this session, we imagined what it would take to plan for 5 meters of sea level rise on the assumption that dikes were not reinforced or raised in order to meet that challenge. So it really entailed serious retreat. It was a very, very interesting session, also because, to my great surprise, instead of sort of freezing at the thought, just the outrageousness of this project actually liberated people's imaginations. And so we came up with some really interesting results, which we could perhaps discuss meanwhile. Now, take a look at this picture. You'll see some cities that you recognize if you know the Netherlands. Rotterdam is there. The Hague is there, Amsterdam is there, Utrecht is on the mainland, just close to the coast. And one of the things I want to call attention to is that this is the only one of those 4 adaptation pathways where Duitsland, that is to say Germany, is clearly indicated. So that tells me that the person who drew this, perhaps on the instruction of the person who commissioned it, you know, was aware that the German border comes into play. That's why my title is Between Need and the German Border. All right. Now, this slide actually doesn't need to be here anymore. Initially, there was some hesitation around meebewegen, so around thinking about accommodate and retreat. There was a quote by the person who was in charge of the consortium looking into meebewegen in the one of the major newspapers, and he said, whatever else meebewegen means in the Netherlands, it does not mean retreat. And that's why you see the red line through retreat. But I have to take this back now, because yesterday he showed very clearly that, at least under those the circumstances that obtained yesterday, he was definitely willing to entertain a retreat. And we actually wound up, the 2 of us, on the same team, and it was a very productive session. So I'm going to take that back a little bit. All right. This would prove that, you know, regardless of what he was said in that quote, meebewegen, as far as Deltares is concerned, definitely does include retreat. So, but this was part of a carefully thought out, let's say, well, carefully. It was given, a lot of thought was given to how to present this to the public, because retreat, which is a difficult concept in any set of circumstances, in the Netherlands, it seemed to be a taboo word. And therefore, there was a great deal of reluctance to even use it at all. And meebewegen seemed to be a way to get around that. And this is one of the only places where I've seen it stated clearly that there was a decision made that meebewegen would mean both accommodate and retreat, even though it mostly implies accommodate and not retreat, and that essentially the word retreat would be avoided. There is a fifth sort of representation of fifth adaptation pathways, but it doesn't come out of the closet very much. In fact, I've only seen it come out once, and that was about a year and a half ago. You can tell by the banner, the little red banner there, and this sort of pictogram, that it does belong to that set of four. It's the fifth one. Verplaatsen means to relocate. And there isn't a cartoon that goes along with it, but there is a representation of a photograph of a depoldered polder, as well as a flood scene in the United States. This is a very suggestive image, but it doesn't come out much, and I don't think it's going to come out again. Meebewegen covers a lot now. It's filling with content, and it's as I experienced yesterday, it's no longer operating as a euphemism, which I think is a good thing. All right. Anyway, this is where the story broke to the public. This was around 2019. I think there had been a few earlier, smaller news reports, but this was a really major article. It says sea level rise is a bigger problem than we think, and the Netherlands doesn't have a plan B. And this is where I get into the the German border question. This is a quotation from that article. The Dutch title there says, or subtitle says, German as a mandatory second language. And one of the experts quoted here is a physical geographer at the University of Utrecht. And he says in this quotation, well, you eventually get at a scenario where the Randstad, right, this collection, this conglomeration of cities in the West, including Amsterdam and The Hague and Rotterdam, moves to Zandstad, meaning Sand City, from Randstad to Sand City, further to the east at a higher elevation. Or he even goes so far as to say, we just become part of the Federal Republic of Germany as one of the new provinces or states, Bundesländer of Germany. And then there are a number of other things he mentions here. And then the last thing he says, and German will become a mandatory second language in secondary school or middle school. So I find this really, really interesting. Why, it's almost, you could imagine, let's put the Netherlands on the couch. We do that in the first Poltergeist video, put the Netherlands on the couch and you say, listen, we're going to do a little spot of free association. I'm going to say a word and you say the first word that pops in your mind. And the Netherlands says, okay, go ahead. And I say, retreat. And the Netherlands promptly says, Germany. So it's that automatic. You encounter it a good bit. And so I've been wondering about that, what's going on there. And I finally came up with what I think is a plausible theory. I think that the Northern European Enclosure Dam and the German border are two extremes, two opposite extremes, and both immensely challenging, and supposed to operate as sort of scare images, right? Frightening images that should persuade people to mitigate and to do other things so that neither of those extremes would be required. So I explained the Northern European Enclosure Dam, where that came from. I also want to talk briefly about this cabaret artist, this comedian, Patrick Nederkorn, with whom I've been working together. He performs both in Dutch and in German. The German performance of the same piece, it's different, but similar piece, let's say, is called The Orange Menace, The Dutch Are Coming. And he plays that in German theaters, mostly along the border. So that includes the Ruhr area, so major cities like Düsseldorf and Bonn and Cologne and so on. And he shows up on their stage in Germany and says, listen, dear Germans, I have something to tell you about sea level rise and about the impact it's going to have on our country. And I'm wondering if you would welcome me and my family and about, maybe 17 million others at some point. I've seen him perform it in Germany as well as in the Netherlands. And the performance and reception in Germany is they're a delightful thing. It's really a delightful thing to watch. And he brings news to Germany that many Germans are not aware of. I would also go on to say that many people in the eastern part of the Netherlands are also not aware of this conversation. And I'd venture to say most people in the rest of the world are not aware of this conversation either. It's pretty much a sort of internal thing that happens in the low-lying parts of the Netherlands. And I think it's important that it be discussed outside of that context as well. Okay, so let's see, what do I have here? This is another one of our videos, How Will the Netherlands Defend Itself Against Climate Change? Why did I bring that into the picture? I'm trying to remember. I think, that's because, yes, this particular video, the third of our 4 videos so far, has a really nice, it is in fact about those 4 adaptation pathways. And I think that it has a really nice representation of meebewegen in a way that, presents it more positively and not as a frightening image. Okay, in the remainder of this, what I would like to do is talk about some things that I've learned in the last 4 weeks that are useful for us, that is for us who are making the videos, but I think that help us to understand meebewegen even more. Yes, different additional aspects of meebewegen. So one of the people we met with is an archaeologist. You see him up here on the left, Mans Schepers. And at this point, we are on top of a terp. Actually, because we're in Groningen, it's called a wierde. And these are habitation mounds that were created, in the course of the first millennium of the Common Era. And archaeologists and physical geographers and other scholars are busy right now revising our understanding of what life before dikes and before pumps and so on, what that was like. So in other words, what was life like in the Netherlands before the impact of building dikes, before the decision to go one way as opposed to another, to protect as opposed to live with water, to protect against water as opposed to live with water. What was that like? The story that the Dutch tell themselves, the Dutch water story, has a stake in representing life before dikes as nasty, brutish, and short, to use Hobbes' language. But the archaeological record would indicate otherwise. So here are some common misconceptions that Mans Schepers and his colleagues are interested in correcting. It isn't the case that the entire landscape flooded twice a day. They didn't lead a miserable life. Terps didn't suddenly lose their function overnight. Terp habitation cannot simply be seen as an initial phase of habitation leading up to permanent embankments, right? A sort of a progress story. And Terps testify to a profoundly different mindset than dikes. And that mindset is meebewegen, essentially. That's why this is important. Let's see what else I've got. Okay, this is the director of Deltaris. She is at a public town hall kind of a meeting in Pakhuis de Zwijger in Amsterdam, and she said some very, very interesting things. She's a person of great integrity who addresses things frankly. In this case, she's quoted as saying, if we don't succeed with our defenses, well, then it probably would make sense for us to become better friends with Germany and to to move to higher elevation in that direction. She also mentioned in this same interview the unique vulnerability of the Netherlands, not just with regard to climate change, but the fact that if, let's say, Russia, in retaliation for the Netherlands, selling or giving arms to Ukraine, had a mind to, they could take out a few dikes or dams here or there, and that would place the Netherlands in a pretty precarious position. All right, so that's another thing to take into consideration. This is an image from a photograph from the House of the Netherlands, which is in Münster, a city near the Dutch border in Germany. This building is where the Dutch and the Spanish negotiated the peace known as the Peace of Münster, which ended the 80 Years' War and established Dutch independence. You could regard it as the birthplace of the Netherlands in a certain sense. And I curated an exhibit there of many of the designs that architects and designers and physical geographers and others have introduced or tried to introduce into the conversation about climate adaptation. And all of these represent, in one way or another, an inundated Netherlands. I thought it would be really, really effective to have this exhibit take place outside of the Netherlands in this historic building in Münster. And it's been a kind of wake-up call, because I think the Dutch thought of their conversation about this as very interior, held in the Dutch language within Dutch borders. But all of a sudden, to see these images come together in large format in Münster was quite a provocation. This exhibit has been visited by over 1,000 people in just a matter of 3 or 4 weeks. It's going to be running until the middle of July. And it's also lived a second kind of virtual life on the internet or on social media, where there's been a lot of discussion and attention to it. Just precisely because it's happening, and Dutch folks are actually very, very surprised, taken aback by it, but also celebrating the fact that this is happening. Let's see, I've got something else, I'm sure. What else do I have? Oh yeah, this is another event that we organized. We did this in Fontes, at Fontes, which is a University of Applied Science in Venlo, also very near the German border, with the partner city of Krefeld, so just across the border. And in this case, you can see it was called Debordering Climate Change. This is an artist's representation of our conversation. What was really nice about this was that we gathered Germans and Dutch people who have an interest, let's say, in business, and also in urban planning and so on. And we spent the day talking about the opportunities that this would present to people on either side of the border at higher elevations. And there was actually quite a bit of excitement. Another case where folks had no idea that conversation was going on in the lower part of the Netherlands, and it was very exciting. You'll notice Antarctica over here, so that slipped in. There's, you can analyze this. You'll see here's Verplaatsen over here, no plan B. All sorts of things got taken up, but it was a very, very interesting meeting. This is also a part of the program that Patrick Nederkorn, that cabaret comedian, and I have been doing. In this case, he performed in a little town called Winterswijk, just a few kilometers away from the German border. And the following day, we had workshops in the corresponding German town. Both of these towns have around 10,000 people, of Vreden. And here we actually have the two mayors. So the mayor of Winterswijk and the mayor of Vreden responding in conversation to the performance that they just saw. Patrick, on the Orange Menace, the Dutch are coming. And that also was actually quite delightful. And the following day, we had a really, really great workshop where basically top scientists from the Netherlands as well as from Germany, so from the Potsdam Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Potsdam near Berlin, as well as the director of the knowledge program for sea level rise. They were there in these two small towns and engaged in conversation about these things with German and Dutch residents from the area. So another part of our effort to expand the conversation, both in the sense of who's participating in the conversation, but also what aspects are taken up. And so we think that it's really, really important to include cultural aspects, to get people involved. All right. Oh, yeah, this is exactly the image, I guess, that I wanted to show. In this case, on my right, you see me in the middle. On my right is the director of the knowledge program for sea level rise, lives in Utrecht, from Rijkswaterstaat. And then on my right, so looking at it on the left, that's a local historian. And we had a really, really great conversation connecting the Peace of Münster with the challenges that lie ahead. We called that the second Peace of Münster. I think this is my last slide, and then I'll knock off. This was another occasion. This took place in Münster at the Haus der Niederlande. And here too, we have a person from Rijkswaterstaat, a person from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, as well as an architect, my colleague Matthijs Bouw, who operates in the Netherlands, in New York, United States, Indonesia, and elsewhere. Okay, let's see. Right, so I'll just stop here and then we can start the conversation. I have come to understand my role, at least for the time being in the Netherlands, to keep retreat on the table in the safest delta in the world. That's how the many Dutch think of where they live. And this summer has shown that through our animated films and through our other efforts in the cultural sector, this is possible. I think we have had, with the support of some climate scientists and adaptation experts, we have had some success in doing precisely that. And we think that that's very, very important. I will stop there.
Thank you, Professor Richter. It's fascinating. You brought up a lot of topics that I think can lead to a rich discussion. As I said at the beginning, we have two discussants that have some remarks. So why don't we go straight to there? Carlien, would you like to begin with some thoughts and questions?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Simon, again for your wonderful presentations and also for sharing with us on last Sunday. So I think it's quite interesting for you to also reflect about the transnational implications of not just climate change, but even managing water in the Netherlands. And for me, it's quite important to, let's say, make more people aware in the Netherlands of this possibility that perhaps they could be climate refugees to the east. And it's even more interesting or more thought-provoking how perhaps an attack from Ukraine or something could have immediate effect or repercussions on us living here now. So I think it's quite interesting, your work, and yeah, we look forward to more good stuff from you. That's all for me for now.
Thank you.
Carlien. Matteo, would you like to share some remarks and questions?
Yeah, I have a few questions. But something is really itching me because I'm an anthropologist, so I'm from the social science, and often it's difficult to engage people from the more technical side, so engineers and also urban planners sometimes, into discussions that takes into account cultural aspects and not just the technocratic perspective. So the building of new green infrastructure or whatsoever. So like a question for you, Simon, if you can tell us a little bit how, from your background in German language and literature, you became part of think tanks that reflect about climate adaptation and sea level adaptation. No, how did it happen, and how is your cultural sensibility seen as an asset?
Yeah, it's astonishing to me, Matteo. But there's, I think I'm going to start with the concept of leverage. When Henk Ovink, who is the outgoing first ever Dutch special envoy for international water affairs, he did Rebuild by Design, and after Hurricane Sandy in the New York area, Resilient by Design in San Diego and the Bay, and some other places, I think, and has been active all over. He wanted to do something along those same lines in the global South, and he called that water as leverage. And he did that in Chennai, in India, and in oh goodness, I always blank on where in Bangladesh, but also in Bangladesh and in Semarang in Indonesia. And you think about water as, you think of leverage, and at least I have this image of something that's hard, and that you leverage it, and that moves, lifts a rock or something like that. That's what comes to mind. And so water as leverage is immediately a sort of provocation or puzzle to thought. How can water be a lever? Of course, it's a metaphor, but I want to grab the idea of that leverage. So culture as leverage, or just the leverage that everybody has, right? So we're all presented with the climate emergency and feel a sense of urgency about this. And then at the same time, what can I do? And so I think assessing, so regardless of how old you are, where you are in life, et cetera, just as a kind of an assessment of, who do I know? What do I care about? What do I do well? What can I talk about? And just starting to talk, starting to do whatever, wherever you are in life, do something. So I started by teaching, right? I made essentially a decision that all of my teaching would begin from the premise of the climate emergency. It doesn't matter. I'll figure out how, it doesn't matter what it is I'm teaching. I'll figure out that connection, because I think that connection matters for everything, for absolutely everything. And so I'm a professor at a university, and I know deans, and I know, professors who are influential and so on. And I spoke to them. Talk to them, ask them to do things. So just ask. I think there's a lot of leverage in asking, because people sort of have to say yes or no. And in my experience, very often people are just waiting for someone to ask them to do something which is in their power. But maybe they were hesitating, maybe they weren't sure that it was the right thing to do, because I think the climate emergency presents itself to everyone in the same, in a certain sense, in the same way, in that there's like, I know I need to do something, but is it legitimate for me to do it in this capacity or not? I think it is. And I think with a little push, many people come to the same conclusion. And so we introduced the 1.5-minute climate lectures, and then we did a climate week at Penn, which we're now preparing the 4th climate week at Penn. So that's what I did at my own institution. But that started to build up my leverage. I think the decision to go with the videos, the animated videos, was, what we say, it was an experiment. We had no idea if it was going to work. The chances are it would not have worked, but for whatever reason, it has been immensely successful, and it's been our leverage for getting, inserting our foot or our mouth into the Dutch conversation. And this just keeps on sort of snowballing along, and it all wouldn't have begun if I hadn't asked for a few $1,000 and the help of 3 young undergraduate animators, and we hadn't launched that first video. So that I think is a great story for how something that doesn't seem that significant, how much leverage can be in there, how much leverage you can find there. And so I don't know how it all works, but yeah, I mean, I'm talking to the people who are making these decisions or who are advising the people who are making these decisions. And I think by staying by cleaving, let's say, to the role of being an advocate for the importance of culture in these conversations, I've been able to point to a lacuna that is, and folks have realized, we do need that. Meebewegen is a cultural question. It's not only a technical question, and so there we go. That's sort of an answer.
I'm going to try to butt in, but I have to apologize. I've lost my voice, so this is probably the only time I'm going to try it. I just wanted to switch the debate a bit towards planning.
Yeah.
And planning history. Sorry, I think it's not going to work. So maybe Richard and Stephen can step up.
Carola, thank you. Professor Richter, you said, and perhaps this is a way in, the group includes architects and urbanists with interest in planning history. And I think it was in Munster, you had a conversation with a local historian. Perhaps that's a way in to reflect on issues of history, but particularly planning history in terms of the way intervention and, one might say, sort of biophysical systems being allowed to run their course, and how history is informing or enters into these conversations that you're having. And if it's planning history, so much the better.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'll try to do my best. I think that, the reference that I made to the work that the archaeologist was doing with regard to this being an alternative mindset, I think that this is really, really profound. When I speak to physical geographers, and the physical geographers in the Netherlands are it's astonishing what knowledge they have about the soil and the water in this country. When I speak to them, it is, you get a very clear indication that what they are studying is a history of mistakes, of compounding mistakes. And this is a history of mistakes that starts perhaps somewhat innocuously with, let's say, some monks digging a ditch and building a little embankment and so on. And over time, they start, mistakes lead, let's say, interventions lead to other problems which require new interventions. They compound, leading to new problems, new interventions, and it just keeps on building. And then in the course of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, what the Dutch call maakbaarheid, right? The makeability, the fact we can make it, and the basically the separation from built environment and water and soil, right? So makeability anywhere, regardless. So 7 meters below sea level, sure, why not? We'll build there. That maakbaarheid, which also goes together with what they call ruilverkaveling, that was the sort of land consolidation process where the basic polder setup, which you see when you fly into Schiphol, where you see these narrow green fields separated by ditches, That patchwork was much more haphazard formerly and smaller scale. Now it's large. It is what it is, but especially where there's peat involved and the vast stretches, that's where it's subsiding very rapidly. So that history of compounding mistakes is, what brought the Netherlands to the place where it is now. And we're in the midst of what the Dutch are calling a polycrisis. So it's not just the climate emergency and, greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and global weirding and so on. It's also what they call the nitrogen crisis, which is a result of their industrial agricultural system. But there are many other aspects to this crisis as well. Oh goodness, I just lost my train of thought. Why did I want to go with this? Goodness, the makeability. Goodness, I'm so sorry, Stephen. I just lost my train of thought. We're talking about, oh goodness. Carlene, you can save me, please. What was I going to say?
I was actually going to have a follow-up question on your comment, because you said this history of compounding mistakes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, because you said 82% of the 1 million homes in the next 10 years are actually in low-lying areas. So if they already have this knowledge, what is their response to it? Because let's say as an architect or as a planner, before you do something or design, you do like an analysis of the area. And I imagine they did like a flood risk analysis to realize that 82% of these 1 million homes are already vulnerable. So in that sense, I wouldn't, if I were a designer, immediately I would know, okay, then perhaps I should either look at another area, or it will inform the kind of design I would then make for these homes, which are, although vulnerable, can still survive in those conditions. So it's what is their response to this findings that they have now?
Right. So this has to do with a semi-specialized Dutch situation where at the same time you have a high level of safety and precarity. Right? The safety comes from what's in place now in this particular location. It may be 7 meters below sea level, but there is a dike and pump system in place which guarantees a pretty high level of safety. Let me add here, there are these norms that you will be quoted to you about, like one in a 10, what is it? One chance, blah, blah, in 10,000 years that there will be one person will lose their life. And it's an immensely high level of security that they aspire to. The dikes right now don't meet that standard. So that's something that is worth looking into. But even the dikes as they exist, they provide a high level of safety. They are brittle, right? Because there's nothing between them. That's what's there. And so, something like imagining a military, a focused military attack, that's something I guess to take into consideration. So the thing is that for any given location with the sort of makeability mindset, they can figure it out. They have lots of resources. They have lots of know-how, they can figure it out. The problem from the climate adaptation perspective is that if you just multiply that across loads and loads of low-lying areas, et cetera, you take away so much flexibility, so much room for maneuvering, which will be required. All of this is on the premise that climate change, sea level rise is going to be gradual, and that we will easily keep up with it. And therefore there isn't really a threat. But others who are sometimes not heard as loudly are aware of Antarctica, and they're not so convinced that it's guaranteed that the Dutch will be able to keep up. They could be overwhelmed. And then, and before then, as it comes into view, they will need a lot of flexibility. And if they've built up those areas, where do you hold water, right? You need buffering for all that water. How do you pump it all out? If you have one-story buildings in areas that are 7 meters below sea level, where are people going to go? What are your evacuation routes? That evacuation question is a really, really important question. And there's a little bit of vertical evacuation available, but the Dutch, by and large, hate tall buildings. And so you don't have very many of those. And if, 8 million people, or a fraction, a good chunk of them tried to get to higher ground on the highways, it's not going to work, right? So there are those issues. So it's strange. You for any locality, you can make a case that it will be safe. But when you add them all up, then you have cumulative insecurity.
I think Jeroen had his hand up.
Yeah. One question is that we're at the hour mark. Simon, if we go over a little bit, are you okay with that?
Sure.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Yeah, well, that was an interesting presentation from your side, Simon, and I enjoyed watching all of those videos. It made me also laugh greatly, but I also felt a little bit embarrassed, and it was also during New York, where the video was displayed at the time. You mentioned, obviously, there will be a cultural shift, which requires a paradigm shift and centuries of basically closed protection kind of approach, and engineering our way out of this was the paradigm to go by, and still is, because we're still making those systemic mistakes basically in our spatial planning. Regardless, we do have a couple of policy letters at the moment, and yeah, perhaps I should introduce myself. I'm myself a policy advisor for the Water Authority, so in the region of Amsterdam, and I have like 15 years experience of adaptation in the international context. Anywho, I believe the different scenarios are not necessarily contradicting. I see that there could be an option between all the four of them, actually, which would only make sense because we have like what they call suitability maps. I don't know if you've heard of them. So what type of, for instance, imagine the 10 meters as you did yesterday. I think that doesn't happen overnight, and there will be some speedy decision-making processes going on to see what's going on and intervene where we feel is necessary. And obviously, yeah, we need to think a little bit different about space. But what would be your preferred route, although you already gave a glance of what the preferred route would be? But this will happen globally. We indeed have all of the capacity to basically to take drastic measures and go into, well, full protect kind of thing, with some openness and building with nature kind of interventions. So
yeah,
how do you see this evolve
Yeah.
from a personal point of view?
Yeah. Let's see. I think your point about room for all four of these is well taken, and the people I've spoken to in Delta Iris, for instance, and in the kennisprogramma, I think they by and large see it that way too. It is important to consider how much time is involved in adapting, however it is you choose to adapt. You said it'd be a fast decision, But as people point out, it took something like 60 years, to complete. Was it 60 years? Well, if you start from the time that Johann von Veen started to propose, the delta works, to the time when they were completed, which is in the mid-90s or so, it took a long time. It takes several decades. And for the assuming that accelerated sea level rise happens at one or another rate, but it is faster than it has been, and it certainly it's doubled or something in the last 10 years. Decisions, it's tricky because decisions have to be made now, but it isn't clear which course to go. So one kind of decision that can be made, and I've heard this argument, really eloquently made, and it seems powerful to me, is don't make bad decisions. Right? If you don't not ready to make the right decision or the good decision, or you don't have the plan in place yet, but don't make bad decisions. But there's a lot of pressure around building new homes, and that's I think that is making that basic decision, don't make bad decisions, is making that really difficult. I don't know that I have a preferred. I mean, there are ways in which I'm sympathetic to meebewegen, and and I would like to write more about that, and perhaps do more in the way of videos about that. But this isn't a matter of lobbying for one thing or for another. It is a matter, I think, of trying to contribute to the conversation or the debate, the discussion, and the decision-making process, so that things that are either difficult to say or controversial, but that need to be said, are there. I guess, is it in the Guardian today or yesterday? There was an article that says the best and worst case scenarios are going to happen, and the worst case scenarios are, we don't know the timing, but the commitments that have been made with regard to, sort of the ice, the rate, or the melting of the ice sheets, and all the heat that has gone into the ocean. This is going to unfold over centuries, and it's not going to stop at 2 meters or at 5 meters or whatever. So that's in place.
Yeah, well, the geological timescales do not really apply or get accelerated at the least. So, but do you feel that, obviously on a more global scales, people talk about tipping points, and we're definitely heading towards a tipping point, as you mentioned. Just as a follow-up, and a brief one, I hope. So, if you perceive the Netherlands as a certain type of system with its boundaries often described too wet, too weak soil, too dry, and all of those, I think it should be possible, and this is me being an engineer, thinking about, okay, what kind of options do we have, and do we already sort out where we will abandon land, and so on, and make strategic decisions in that regard? Because I know the insurance sector is doing that already for a decade at least, based upon land subsidence maps and all of the geospatial information available to make sound investment decisions. Okay, like for instance, we still, or at least institutional investors and like the data centers that you see pop up, they typically, well, have a return on investment about 5 years. So it's still fine for them to build in very low-lying areas. For a house and people that have a mortgage with a bank, that becomes already a little bit more difficult. So we need a bit of a transition between these, where the economy will at least have has options to develop a little bit further, yeah, but we also need bold decisions in, okay, until this point and no further. And I think those climate adaptation pathways that also been described by Deltaros, for instance, offer at least those options on a broader time scale. And that also adheres to the questions asked by Carola. It is it is basically you're going towards adaptive spatial planning. But that's an rather old concept to me, at least already. But we need to dust it off perhaps and explore the other options as well. For instance, retreat or meebewegen.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've been exploring around the German and Belgian borders is, the idea, what would make it appealing? What would make it attractive? Why might people who live in Maastricht or in Venlo or in Enschede, and so why might they not think to themselves when they hear about the exorbitant amounts of money that will be required to invest in the kind of coastal defenses and other adaptations in the West? Why might they not think to themselves, look at that, look at those investments, look at all of that spending that's going on there, when perhaps it's because of the uncertainty of Antarctica, it isn't even clear that that's a really sound investment. Shouldn't, just for fairness sake, and also for the sake of actually putting your money where your mouth is, when you say that meebewegen really is on the table, shouldn't there also be infrastructural investments in the East? Shouldn't there be diplomacy across the borders that starts to stitch our cities closer together by ways of, through infrastructure and so on? Isn't that an important investment in climate adaptation and in the future as well? So that should it turned out to be the case that sea level rises more quickly and more and also at a high, and it's higher than we anticipated, so that those regions are better prepared to accommodate people who leave the low-lying areas to go to the east. Seems to me that that's a reasonable thing to say.
Vicente, you've been patient. Would you like to? We have a lot of important observations and questions from Carola, but Vicente, maybe you begin and then we can move into those.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Simon, for the great presentation. It was very insightful. There were a lot of things in there that I also was not yet fully aware of. But I wanted to ask you something also following up on some of the things you mentioned, and also some of the questions, comments that Carola put in the chat related to what kind of planning histories on spatial planning stories we should be further thinking of. I was wondering especially about more about even more on the subjectivities and the sensitivities of people living in the environments that we're talking about, so in the Netherlands and those places that are likely to face big changes in the near future, and other spaces that need to accommodate that, so the East versus the West, for instance. And I was wondering to what extent you also feel like, or you maybe want to do that, or you think this should be helpful in further informing these insights on these different high-level plans that you showed, the meebewegen versus the other things. To what extent do you want to delve further into like the mentalities of people actually living in, like, for instance, the East versus the Randstad? Because I'm also thinking about what we could learn in terms of how this could enrich spatial planning insights on how people in a very individual and a day-to-day context negotiate for themselves the kind of situation they're in terms of the place they live and what this place might look like differently in the near future, and to what extent they believe or not whether they should make a drastic change in their lives in terms of where they will live, or whether they can still keep living in the place that they do. And I'm also wondering in that respect, indeed, about how this we can further explain this culturally, you know, as Netherlands being maybe a country where there's a lot of pragmatic attitude in terms of the lives that people live, but maybe also in terms of the differences in the Netherlands themselves. But I'm thinking of political differences here. If the East is the region where we have to retreat to more, which is also kind of the country, the region which is often shown as that part of the country which is less happy with how things are being run in the Netherlands on the political level. But then again, we have the Randstad, which is mostly in danger of the sea level rise. But maybe there you might find those people who have more the optimistic side, thinking that, well, those people highly educated in power will be able to sort it out. So we can just keep living the way we do in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. So I was wondering to what extent you think we should and we can, and to delve into this further, and how can maybe this also be further, systematically being documented in like spatial ways, also in terms of, in addition to the master plans, the spatial plans that we have, and that we are discussing here on a national level.
Wow, really great questions. One of the videos that we're working on right now is on subsidence, and we're making well, I don't know. Yeah, we're making a connection between the building of the Afsluitdijk and Sigmund Freud's introduction of the tripartite model of the soul. And the reason for that is that Freud, at the end of the introductory lecture in which he introduces those three aspects of the human soul, says that the work of psychoanalysis is like land reclamation, where it was, their ego shall be. It's like the work the Dutch are doing to reclaim land from the Zuiderzee. We use that as a way to imagine what we call the subsiding ego. And the subsiding ego, the way that we're thinking about that is that from the perspective of the subsiding ego, everything is under control, everything is fine. And, you know, I have enormous admiration for this huge workforce around Rijkswaterstaat, around the municipalities, the provinces, the waterschappen, at Deltaris, at the various universities, TU Delft, Wageningen, Utrecht, Groningen, you know, that contribute, all of this. It's just an incredible wealth of commitment and knowledge and know-how and so on. And then, you know, when you factor in all the other things like the, you know, the magnificent mobility infrastructure and also, you know, what we say, the art of quality of life in the Netherlands, just how incredibly wonderful it is to live in a Dutch city and to enjoy all of these amenities. All of that, you know, seems to be working, but what keeps it going and what needs to be looking ahead to the increasing challenges of keeping it going, you know, that suggests to me a kind of an ego that is subsiding and that is doing everything it can to maintain that normality, which is very high level, also, of course, carbon intensive, but very high level and carbon intensive level of, you know, Dutch consumer normality requires incredible apparatus of maintenance, let's say. So I mention this now because you were talking about sort of the perceptions of people.
Yes, exactly.
Nederland and Laat Nederland, and you know, I had used that word sea level rise optimism. The other two terms that I use sometimes are sea level polder arrogance and polder complacency. Polder arrogance being that feeling, you know, of course we can do this. And polder complacency being its sort of counterpart, kind of what polder arrogance sort of hopes for, requires, delivers is a feeling among the population, of course, it's all fine, you know, komt wel goed, we'll all be fine. And so I think that makes, you know, consulting, let's say, you know, the sentiment or of mentality of people somewhat complicated, because it's likely, you know, that for many, there's a stake in sort of saying it's all fine. You guys are just exaggerating. There's no need for panic and so on. And yeah, anyway, so that's one way I would respond. So I'll just say I think what you're suggesting is important, but I think it's quite complicated. In a way that so many things are in the Netherlands are complicated, because you have at one and the same time a high level of security and a high level of precarity. They're both there.
Yeah, thank you. I understand, and great to hear, Need, about these other mentalities, Need, that you are putting in the picture to yeah, understand how people also on a more personal level negotiate this for themselves. Yeah. I'll leave it at this. I see other questions already coming in the chat, so thank you for your answers, Simon.
Thank
Sure.
you. Gentlemen, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hello. Thank you, Simon. I also have to thank you. I saw your video on keeping retreat on the table at the start of my graduation project here at the TU Delft. I'm in the architecture program, and it really helped me to bypass some of the bias and myopia that I found in some of the literature produced at our university. Well, I think I put the question rather shortly in when I typed it, so I can just reread it, but I could say more about it also. So my question was to reflect, if you could reflect on the coloniality of Dutch planning, like you did in the video on Jakarta and the Randstad.
Yeah.
And perhaps also reflect on the current involvements of companies such as Boskalis. And then as an aside, how was it to talk to them?
Yeah.
And maybe just to add, I really find the threat of Boskalis to leave the Netherlands very interesting. And also
let's start with Johan van Veen's book, Dredge, Drain, Reclaim. He has a chapter on dredging there, which I think is really worth reading. He understood back then that dredging was a really important source of income for the Netherlands, and also a source of employment. And I would say his words have been borne out, right? So as I understand it, there are two major Dutch dredging firms. There's a Belgian firm, and then there's some Chinese firms, and maybe there are some other Asian firms as well, but they're not too many. And the equipment that they use is very specialized and extremely expensive. And the need for the things that dredging does, capital improvements, maintenance, and what's the third thing? I'm blanking on the third thing, but so dredging, like riverways and so on, keeping things clear, but also doing the sand suppletions, the beach nourishments, the dune stuff that they do. So that's going on in the Netherlands, but it's going on all over the world, and that's obviously a growth market. It depends on sand. You probably know that sand is becoming regionally a scarce commodity, and that it is therefore also what we say, there's a lot of inequality there, and violence has crept in. There's sand piracy. There are people who follow these stories that involve actually murder at this point, because there's raiding of sand that occurs, and so you can explore that, and so that's going to be tricky, or is already tricky. So there's that. there is the matter of, wealthy countries versus less wealthy countries, and, countries like China, like Singapore, others need sand for their land reclamation projects and their water defense projects, raising the land around their perimeter and so on. And they don't have the sand, so they will look for it elsewhere. Some of it will be acquired illegally, and some will be in a sort of a gray zone. And then you also have the sort of ecological destruction and destruction of livelihoods that occurs, thinking of the Manila Bay Airport in the Philippines, where I think Boscalis is the major player there. So they're in a tricky territory. Yeah, so that is it a kind of neocolonialism? Not an expert on that. I think it's likely. I guess I want to finish with one other thing, because I learned, you were talking about Boscalis. I didn't learn this from the Boscalis person we talked to, but I learned this from someone else the following day. He said that Boscalis and Van Oort regard the coast of Texel as the Gold Coast. And the reason for that is that it's a coast that will keep on giving to them, insofar as they will continue to need to feed sand into that system, and so it's a profit maker for them. But because there was a prior Dutch Gold Coast on the coast of Ghana in Africa, it occurred to me, wow. That's almost like an unconscious admission that they've gotten to the point that Boscalis and Van Oort are neo-colonizing the Netherlands. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly more complicated than that, but nonetheless, those firms are in a position of enormous sort of power, and one would want them to exercise that power responsibly and ethically, but that's as with our fossil fuel industries, that's not too likely.
Thank you.
I could take maybe like one more, but I have an appointment at 2 o'clock that I need to get to.
No, Gabriel and Richard, would you want to have a last question? Particularly, I mean, how does this sound for, say, Australia?
Well, if I may, I would like to ask one last question, if you all allow me. And I was wondering whether to take it back to the question of planning and let's say promoting an inclusive everyday life on livable cities. And do you see the idea of, let's say, blurring borders as a way to confront, let's say, climate change or climate challenges as a tool, or as an ends or as means? Could we use then this to promote inclusive societies, or this is then the way to deal with climate change? Is then say, could we think of the methods of confronting climate change also as a tool to promote inclusive urban societies as well?
Yeah, I think that's really a great question and a great point. If I could turn back to the Northern European Enclosure Dam versus the German border, that opposition that I set up in line with, sort of in alignment with Advance and Meebewegen, the need looks to me, whether it's intended that way or not, like a fortress, like Fortress Europe, intended, in the first place to protect it from accelerated sea level rise. But if Europe manages to do that and the seas rise to that point, just think of all of the coastal areas, low-lying coastal areas that have been inundated and who do not have the resources that the Germans, or excuse me, that the Europeans have. And if it's sort of like this just goes hand in hand. You build a fortress around yourself to keep the water out. Certainly, you will also be keeping immigrants out, climate refugees or out as well, in order to protect your space, right? So Fortress Europe is already pretty much in place with pushbacks and all the other things that we have seen. And so I think that there is that on the one side. Meebewegen, it seems to me, if it asks questions about the border, is likely to be, premised on something that involves a lot more inclusiveness. Certainly also in the sense that, as Carleen pointed out, it puts the Dutch, at least, sort of virtually, and maybe even more than virtually, in the position of a refugee themselves, that is having to depart an area that is threatened or inundated, to go elsewhere and to have to cross a border. And as some Germans we've spoken to pointed out, you may, the Schengen may be there right now, but if the numbers start to really ramp up, don't assume that we're going to say, oh, Dutch people, yes, of course, please come in. But you others from the global south, sorry, no, you can't. It may not work out that way, right? So I think that in thinking about the border, in talking about the border with people from either side of the border, this is a really important question. This is why we had Karim Santu from the PIK there, because he's a specialist in climate migration. And the portion of the piece of Münster that the second piece of Münster that we sort of set up as a kind of a rubric to think these things through, the portion that he was a referee for, or an informant for, was peace with the unknown, peace with the unfamiliar, peace with the person sort of not from a European place, or not from a Northwestern European place. That seems to me to be an absolutely crucial one. If that's not a part of the picture, then then human rights are being violated, and then that is not the basis upon which to proceed.
Simon, I want to thank you again on behalf of the IPHS, and to thank everyone for joining us here today. Carola put some important points about the third webinar coming up with Matthias Vansen, as well as the newsletter link, which everyone should look at, in our 2024 Hong Kong conference with Simon. You should join us, Simon, if you get a chance in Hong Kong. We'd love to see you there. But unless anyone else has any final remarks, Carola, can you say anything final, or is it not possible? No. Okay.
I can only say thank you. Thank you, Simon, and I look forward to meeting you and talking further when I have a voice. Sorry.
Okay. Fine. Feel better. Feel better. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. Simon, once again, thank you. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the third webinar soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.